Good day, grade 9. We are now going to talk about the Romantic era. We have studied three great masters of the Viennese classical school: Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Now, certain characteristics of Beethoven's music, his striking dynamic contrasts, his explosive accents, his expansion of strict classical forms, his hymn-like slow movements, and the overall dramatic intensity of his music clearly foreshadow the Romantic style. The music of another Viennese master, Franz Schubert, reveals him to be the heir to the classical tradition. His approach to chamber music and the symphony. Schubert followed in a direct line of development from Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, but Schubert's life coincided with the first upsurge of Romanticism, and in his songs, we can hear many of the prime interests of this new Romanticism, especially a fascination with nature. One song that beautifully captures the imagery of the subject is The Shroud, or Die Forel, with its folk-like melody and bubbling accompaniment. 2 years after he wrote this song, Schubert used the tune in the fourth movement of his popular piano quintet in A major, well known as the Shroud. This chamber music movement, a theme and variations, and the song that forms its basis reveal in Schubert the happy marriage of classical forms and romantic content. Now let's talk about more of the 19th century. The Romantic era, which grew out of the social and political upheavals that followed the French Revolution, came into full blossom in the second quarter of the 19th century. The French Revolution resulted from the inevitable clash between the momentous social forces. It signaled the transfer of power from a hereditary landholding aristocracy to the middle class, firmly rooted in urban commerce and industry. Like the American Revolution, this upheaval ushered in a social order shaped by the technological advances of the Industrial Revolution. The new society, based on free enterprise, emphasized the individual as never before. The slogan of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, inspired hopes and visions to which artists responded with zeal, sympathy for the oppressed, interest in simple folk and in children, faith in humankind and its destiny, all form part of the increasingly democratic character of the Romantic period. The Romantic poets rebelled against the conventional concerns of their classical predecessors. These poets were drawn to the fanciful, the picturesque, and the passionate. One of the prime traits of all Romantic artists was their emphasis on intensely emotional expression. Another was their sense of uniqueness, their heightened awareness of themselves as individuals apart from all others. As said by Jean Jacques Rousseau, I am different from all the men I have seen. If I am not better, at least I am different. In Germany, a group of young writers created a new kind of lyric poetry that culminated in the art of Heinrich Heine, who became a favorite poet in Romantic composers. A similar movement in France was led by Victor Hugo, its greatest prose writer, and Alphonse de Lamartine, the greatest poet. In England, the revolt against the formalism of the classical age produced an outpouring of lyric poetry that reached its peak in the works of Byron, Shelley, and Keats. The newly won freedom of the artists proved to be a mixed blessing. Confronted by a bourgeois world indifferent to artistic and cultural values, artists felt more and more cut off. a new type emerged: the artist as bohemian, the rejected dreamer who starved in an attic and through peculiarities of dress and behavior shocked the bourgeois. Eternal longing, regret for the lost happiness of childhood, and indefinable discontent that gnawed at the soul. These were the ingredients of the romantic mood. Yet, the artist's pessimism had its basis in reality. It became apparent that the high hopes fostered by the revolution were not to be realized overnight. Despite the brave slogans, all people were not yet equal or free. Inevitably, optimism gave way to doubt and disenchantment, and that's the illness of the century. This state of mind was reflected in the arts of that time. Hugo dedicated Les Miserables to the unhappy ones of the earth. The 19th century novel found one of its greatest themes in the conflict between the individual and society. Jean Valjean, the hero of Hugo's novel, Heathcliff in Emily Brons's Wuthering Heights, and Tolstoy's Anna Karenina are among the memorable characters who point up the frustrations and guilts of the 19th century. Some writers sought escape by glamorizing the past, as did Sir Walter Scott in Ivanhoe and Alexander Dumas' Père in The Three Musketeers. A longing for far off lands inspired the exotic scenes that glow on the canvases of J.M.W. Turner and Eugene Delacroix. The romantic world was one of the strangeness and wonder. The eerie landscape we meet in Coleridge Kubla Khan, Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, and Poe's The Raven. Romanticism dominated the artistic output of the 19th century. It gave its name to a movement and an era, and created a multitude of colorful works that still hold millions in thrall. Now, what about romantic music? Art mirrors the great social forces of its time. Thus, romantic music reflected the profound changes that were taking place in the 19th century at every level of human existence. The Industrial Revolution brought with it the means to create cheaper and more responsive musical instruments, with technical improvements that strongly influenced the sound of romantic music. For example, the addition of valves to brass instruments made them much more maneuverable, so that composers like Wagner and Tchaikovsky would write melodies for the horns and trumpets that would have been unplayable in the time of Haydn and Mozart. Several new wind instruments were developed as well, including the tuba and the saxophone. As a result of improved manufacturing techniques, the piano acquired a cast iron frame and thicker strings, giving it a deeper and more brilliant tone. So if a piano work by Liszt sounds different from a sonata by Mozart, it is not only because Liszt's era demanded a different kind of expression, but also because he was writing for a piano capable of effects that were impossible in the earlier period. The gradual democratization of society resulted in the broadening of educational opportunities. New conservatories were established in the chief cities of Europe to train more and better musicians, so that 19th century composers could count on performers whose skill was considerably more advanced than in former times. And as music moved from palace and church to the public concert hall, orchestras increased in size, giving composers a more varied and colorful means of expression. This naturally had a direct influence on the sound. New instruments such as the piccolo, English horn, and contrabassoon added varied timers and extended the extreme high and low ranges of the orchestra. The dynamic range also expanded. It was far greater than that of the 18th century ensemble. Sweeping contrasts of loud and soft now lent new drama to the music of the Romantics. And as orchestral music developed, so did the technique of writing for instruments, individually and together. Orchestration became an art in itself. Composers now had a palette as broad as painters, and they use it to create mood and atmosphere, to suggest nature scenes, and to evoke profound emotional responses. With all these developments, it was no longer feasible to direct an orchestra from the keyboard or the first violin desk, as had been the tradition in the 18th century. And thus, the practice of having a central figure, the conductor, guide the performance became widely accepted. Now, in order to communicate their intentions as precisely as possible, composers developed a vocabulary of highly expressive terms. Among the directions frequently encountered in the 19th century musical scores are dolce or sweet, songful, cantabile, dolente or weeping, mesto or sad, maestoso, majestic, gioioso, joyous, or con amore, with love or tenderly. These similar these and similar terms suggest not only the character of the music, but the frame of mind behind it. Now, the interest in folklore and the rising tide of nationalism inspired Romantic musicians to make increased use of the folk songs and dances of their native lands. As a result, a number of national idioms, Hungarian, Polish, Russian, Bohemian, Scandinavian, and eventually American, flourished greatly, enriching the melodic and harmonic and rhythmic language of music. Now, 19th century exoticism manifested itself first in the northern nations' longing for the warmth and color of the South, and second in the West's interest in the fairy tale splendors of Asia and the Far East. The first impulse found expression in the works of German, French, and Russian composers who turned for inspiration to Italy and Spain. Now, the glamour of the East was brought to international attention by the Russian National School, whose music is pervaded by the fairy tale background of Asia. Rimsky-Korsakov's orchestrally resplendent Scheherazade is one is but one example that found flavor with Western audiences. A number of French and Italian opera composers also drew on exotic themes. Camille Saint-Saëns in Samson and Delilah, Verdi in Aida, and Giacomo Puccini in Madame Butterfly. These are the operas that are famous in the 19th century. Now, the 19th century, above all, was the period when musicians tried to make their instruments sing. It is no accident that themes from romantic symphonies, concertos, and other instrumental works have been transformed into popular songs. For romantic melody was marked by a lyricism that gave it an immediate emotional appeal. This is evidenced by the enduring popularity of the tunes of Schubert, Verdi, and Tchaikovsky, among others. Through innumerable songs and operas, as well as instrumental pieces, romantic melody appealed to a wider audience than music ever had before. The 19th century music strove for a harmony that was highly emotional and expressive. Composers such as Richard Wagner employed various combinations of pitches that were more chromatic and dissonant than those of their predecessors. Romantic composers gradually expanded the instrumental forms. they had inherited from the 18th century to give their ideas more time to play out. A symphony by Haydn or Mozart takes about 20 minutes to perform. Now, one by Tchaikovsky, Brahms, or Dvorak lasts at least twice that long. As public concert life developed, the symphony became the most popular genre of orchestral music, comparable to the novel in Romantic literature. New orchestral forms emerged as well, including the one movement symphonic poem, the choral symphony, and the works for solo voice with orchestra. Music in the 19th century drew steadily closer to literature and painting, that is, to elements that lay outside the realm of sound. Now, the connection with the Romantic poetry and drama is most obvious in the case of music with words. However, even in their purely orchestral music, the Romantic composers responded to the mood of the time and captured with remarkable vividness and emotional atmosphere that surrounded 19th century poetry and painting. 19th century music was linked to dreams and passions, to profound meditations on life and death, human destiny, God and nature, pride in one's country, desire for freedom, the political struggles of the age, the ultimate triumph of good over evil. These intellectual and emotional associations, nurtured by the Romantic movement, brought music into a commanding position as a moral force, a vision in human greatness, and a direct link between the artist's inner life and the outside world. Now, the emergence of a new kind of democratic society strongly affected the lives of composers and performers. Musical life began to center on the public concert hall as well as the salons of the aristocracy and upper middle class. Where 18th century musicians have functioned under the system of aristocratic patronage and had been dependent on the favor of royal courts or the nobility, 19th century musicians were supported by the new middle class audience, whom they met as equals. Indeed, as solo performers began to dominate the concert hall, whether as pianists, violinists, or conductors, they became stars or idols who were well idolized by the public. Mendelssohn, Liszt, and Paganini were welcomed into the great homes of their time as celebrities, unlike Haydn and Mozart half a century earlier. Music thrived both in private homes and in the public life of the most cities and towns. Permanent orchestras and singing societies abounded. Printed music was readily available at a cost that many could afford, and music journals kept the public informed about musical activities and new works. With the expansion of musical life, composers and performing artists were called on to assume new roles as educators. Felix Mendelssohn, active as a composer, pianist, and conductor, used his immense prestige to found and direct the Leipzig Conservatory, whose curriculum became model for music schools all over Europe and America. Robert Schumann became a widely read critic. Franz Liszt, a completely extensive composer, conductor, and considered to be the greatest pianist of his time, taught and trained a generation of great concert pianists. And Richard Wagner directed his own theater at Bayreuth, thus helping the newly interested public understand his musical dramas. That is Romanticism in music in the 19th century.